Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the atomic blows that ended World War II. Few events in World War II's final chapter carry the same weight as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6 and August 9, 1945, the United States unleashed weapons of unprecedented destructive power against Japanese cities, effectively forcing Emperor Hirohito to announce surrender days later. Today, historians and ethicists still debate whether the bombings were necessary or if a diplomatic end might have been reached otherwise. Regardless, those two mushroom clouds indelibly shaped the post-war world, heralding the nuclear age, influencing Japan's transition from militarism to pacifism, and altering international politics permanently. To grasp why these bombings occurred, one must explore not only the strategic calculus in Washington but also the war-torn context within Japan, where defeat loomed yet entrenched factions refused to capitulate. By mid-1945, Japan's empire lay in disarray. Allied forces had seized island strongholds across the Pacific, reclaimed the Philippines, and launched devastating firebombing raids that incinerated Tokyo and dozens of other cities. Submarine warfare strangled shipping lanes, starving the home islands of raw materials. Yet militarist hardliners remained defiant, clinging to visions of a final stand on Japanese soil, hoping the Allies' casualty toll would force a negotiated peace. In the US, President Harry S. Truman, newly in office following Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, faced an imminent choice: authorize a massive amphibious invasion of Japan's home islands or deploy the newly tested atomic weapon. An invasion, codenamed Operation Downfall, promised staggering Allied casualties and a bloodbath among civilians pressed to fight with bamboo spears. Truman and his advisors believed the bomb might shock Tokyo into surrender, saving both American and Japanese lives in the long run. On August 6, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped a single uranium-based atomic device, nicknamed Little Boy, over Hiroshima. Within moments, the city center vaporized under a blinding flash. Tens of thousands died instantly from the fireball and shockwave. Thousands more suffered lethal burns and radiation poisoning. Survivors recount an eerie landscape of rubble, twisted steel, and charred bodies. Hospitals were destroyed, meaning limited medical care for the wounded. The Japanese High Command hesitated to accept this new reality, uncertain if it was a one-off superweapon or if more bombs might follow. Emperor Hirohito and the Supreme Council awaited clarity, some hoping that even this devastating blow wouldn't break the fighting spirit. But 2 days later, on August 8, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, invading Manchuria with overwhelming force. This shattered any notion of a negotiated settlement with Moscow, removing one of Tokyo's last diplomatic lifelines. Then came the second bomb on August 9, dropped by the B-29 Boxer on Nagasaki, a plutonium-based device called Fat Man. Though the city's hilly terrain somewhat contained the blast, it still killed tens of thousands. The combined effect of the Soviet advance and the second atomic strike pushed Emperor Hirohito to overrule the hardliners. On August 15, he made his historic radio broadcast, urging his people to endure the unendurable and accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms. Even then, a faction of officers attempted a coup to prevent surrender, but it failed. By September 2nd, officials signed the formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri, concluding one of history's most devastating wars. For survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the aftermath was an unthinkable nightmare. Beyond the immediate carnage, radiation sickness inflicted agonizing symptoms: hair loss, bleeding, fever, infections. Many succumbed in the weeks following the blasts, while others developed long-term illnesses, including cancers and genetic damage. Doctors struggled to understand the nature of radiation injuries, as nuclear warfare was wholly unprecedented. Local communities faced a slow, painful rebuild, haunted by the label hibakusha, bomb-affected people, often enduring social stigma or discrimination in marriage and employment. Over time, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became global symbols of nuclear horror, hosting peace memorials and museums that display haunting artifacts, melted coins, shadows burned into pavement, and personal testimonies from survivors. In the international realm, the bombings remain profoundly controversial. Some Allied leaders argued the atomic strikes were justified because they ended the war quickly, potentially sparing millions of casualties on both sides. They cited Japan's fierce defense at Iwo Jima and Okinawa as indicators that an invasion would be catastrophic. Critics, however, question whether Japan was already near collapse. Was the Soviet entry alone enough to force surrender? Could a demonstration detonation on an uninhabited island have sufficed as a warning? Why Nagasaki, just 3 days after Hiroshima, when the shock of the first bomb was still settling in? These moral and strategic debates reflect deeper questions about the threshold for using weapons of mass destruction. For the US, the bombs also signaled a post-war stance of nuclear deterrence, influencing Cold War dynamics with the Soviet Union and setting off a global arms race that overshadowed much of the 20th century. For Japan's collective memory, Hiroshima and Nagasaki encouraged a vehement anti-nuclear stance, culminating in the pacifist Article 9 of its constitution. Polls show most Japanese remain opposed to nuclear armament, even though the country's self-defense posture has evolved under US alliances. The annual memorial ceremonies in Hiroshima's Peace Park and Nagasaki's Peace Park draw global attention each August, reaffirming a commitment to the abolition of nuclear weapons. Survivors, many now well into their senior years, continue to speak out, urging the world to see the bomb's horrific human toll, not just as statistics but as personal stories of suffering. The domestic narrative often frames Japan as a victim of nuclear devastation, though it sometimes glosses over the preceding years of aggressive war Japan waged in Asia, a tension that complicates the national discourse on wartime guilt and atonement. Importantly, the bombs also forced reflection among Allied scientists and leaders. Figures like J. Robert Oppenheimer, who headed the Manhattan Project, later wrestled with guilt and ethical dilemmas, famously saying, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The US military, for its part, integrated nuclear capabilities into strategic doctrine, culminating in decades of Cold War brinkmanship. Hiroshima and Nagasaki thus serve as a dire warning of nuclear warfare's immediate carnage and its psychological impact on future generations, an impact that can cross borders and centuries. Indeed, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which many nations have signed but major nuclear powers have not, often references Hiroshima and Nagasaki as rallying cries for a nuclear-free world. From a historical viewpoint, the atomic bombings are inseparable from Japan's broader World War II context. The leadership's steadfast refusal to concede defeat, even after a year of strategic bombing and submarine blockades, set the stage for these final blows. US planners, likewise, confronted a battered but unyielding enemy, culminating in a drastic solution they believed would end the war. The subsequent occupation of Japan, guided by General MacArthur, further shaped how the narrative of the bombings took hold domestically and abroad. Allied authorities downplayed the gruesome radiation effects in early reports, seeking to justify the bomb's usage. Over time, as more medical data emerged and survivors testified, the scale of human tragedy gained global recognition. The lessons are manifold. Morally, Hiroshima and Nagasaki highlight the terrifying power of nuclear arms. A single bomb can annihilate a city, scorching civilians, reducing infrastructure to ash, and leaving lethal radiation in its wake. Strategically, it demonstrates that no nation's will to fight can make up for the unstoppable force of advanced weaponry. Once introduced, such devices change the rules of conflict. Diplomatically, it underscores how war's momentum can drive decision-makers to extremes, with competing objectives and misjudgments culminating in a point of no return. And for Japan, it cemented a sharp pivot from militarism to pacifism, forging a society that, in the decades after, rechanneled its energies into economic innovation and global peace advocacy. To the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the bombs remain personal, etched into their bodies and memories. Their stories remind us that behind every strategic rationale or policy debate, there are human lives irreparably changed by war's cruelty. Indeed, the entire history of World War II in the Pacific, spanning Pearl Harbor, island hopping, Bataan, and beyond, culminated in the searing flash of nuclear fire. It ended one of humanity's deadliest conflicts but also ignited a new era dominated by nuclear deterrence. Understanding these bombings thus requires acknowledging both the relief that came with war's end and the haunting legacy of unimaginable destruction. Subscribe to Legends of the Battlefield for more stories of brilliant tactics and legendary leaders.